Okay, thank you, Dionysis. So I am Zeta Avarikioti. I recently started as a postdoc at IST Austria. This is the Institute of Science and Technology in Austria, in Vienna. I joined the cryptography group here, led by Christoph Pietezak. My work so far is on blockchain, and the work I'm going to talk today is actually last year's work, which was done at TTH. I recently finished my PhD there. So it's in collaboration with my previous supervisor, Roger Wattenhofer at TTH, Zurich, and with a collaborator, Lefteris Kokoriskogios, who is a researcher in Novi Research and will join IST also later. So I'm going to talk to you about sharding. And specifically, we're going to look at sharding from a theoretical perspective, and we will try to formalize what sharding protocols are. I will start with a brief introduction. I don't know the audience if they know. So we all know that blockchain is a revolutionary thing that allowed us to have a system of trust without having the need for a trusted third party. But the implementation of this technology continues to pose significant challenges, specifically related to efficiency. The throughput, which is the transactions per second the systems can handle, is not high enough to compete against pre-existing systems. Now, Bitcoin and Ethereum can support only tens of transactions per second, while payment service providers like Visa processes thousands of transactions per second. Now, for blockchains to support large-scale applications, we need some kind of solutions. Now, the community has been researching this issue for a very long period of time, and we have multiple solutions proposed so far. At the present, we have two major layer expansions, layer 1 and layer 2, to address this issue. In layer 2, in high level, what we do is that we move a considerable part of the workload of the chain. And such technologies are payment channels or side chains. In layer 1, on the other hand, also known as on-chain scaling, we directly increase the transaction processing capacity on the chain. Common ways to do so is to change the consensus algorithm or use different structures. Instead of chains, we use DAGs, for instance, and sharding. There are some solutions that lie between these two, like commit chains and rollups, but the focus of our work, of this work, is on sharding. Now, sharding generally employs parallelizability as a notion to address this scaling issue. So we'll start with the first question, and that we need to answer and understand is what is a sharding exactly. In high level, now sharding systems employ multiple blockchains in parallel, and these are called shards, and they operate under the same consensus. The transaction space is divided is partitioned into the shards, and different sets of participants run the consensus and validate transactions independently, and this is how the system scales. Now, in case the transaction is a cross-shard, meaning that they are not independent, but they run across multiple shards, a protocol must be employed to guarantee the atomic operation. What I mean by atomic operation is that these cross-shard transactions have to either be aborted or executed in all the relevant shards. Now, sharding seems like a very straightforward solution to our problem of scalability, because when we have more nodes, we can simply increase the shards. However, designing efficient and secure sharding faces many challenges. One challenge sharding system face is, for example, how to divide the participants into the shards. If, for instance, we divide the participants in the shards in a naive way, then we can have a single shard, as shown in the picture, that has many malicious nodes. This can lead to security implications. For instance, these nodes can double spend within the shard or even across shards. Another challenge of designing robust sharding protocols is how to handle efficiently cross-shard transactions. Now, ideally, the transactions in each shard only involve accounts that are assigned to this specific shard. But it might not be the case. And in this case, we might have, for instance, a transaction where an account from the blue shard wants to send money to an account in the red shard. Now, in this case, we need to make sure, as we said before, that either both the transactions or none of the transactions are executed, meaning that we need to guarantee the atomistic transactions. Now, if the atomicity is not guaranteed, maybe we can double spend. And also, on top of that, we need to make sure that this protocol that handles this cross-shard communication does not have a high overhead in storage or in communication, because otherwise the sharding will not actually improve on a non-sharded system. Now, there are various solutions in the literature on how to design sharding systems, and all of these works claim they can securely and efficiently shard the blockchain. But most of these works define what sharding means in a different manner, and they present this performance evaluation in which they show that they have increased transaction throughput compared to the other works. But we observed a lack of common ground, and our goal in this work is exactly to fill in this gap. So we want to define what sharding is in a formal manner. So present a formal framework that will allow us essentially to determine whether the protocols actually achieve sharding in a secure and efficient manner. And using this framework, we can further evaluate their performance and also compare the sharding protocols to each other. So exactly this is what we will discuss today. Now, before we proceed to the core results of the paper, I will introduce the model. In other words, the assumptions of this work. Firstly, we assume that we have a synchronous model, which means that the protocol proceeds in rounds, and we will consider multiple consecutive rounds to define an epoch. Regarding the adversary, our second assumption is that the adversary is computationally bounded, so that cryptography holds, and that he can control up to F out of N parties. And that means in a permissionless setting that it translates to assuming essentially that the adversary controls a percentage of the computational power in proof of work or a percentage of the stake in proof of stake. And our third assumption is that the adversary is slowly adaptive. That means that the adversary is adaptive from epoch to epoch, so during the epoch transition, but it is static within each epoch. To define what sharding is, we introduce 4 properties. We built upon the seminal work of Garay et al. That is called the Bitcoin Backbone Protocol, where they define what a distributed ledger is. We extend their model to encapsulate the essence of sharding protocols, and we define what a distributed sharded ledger is. Our first property is persistence, and it is a security property that states that if a transaction is confirmed by an honest party, then no honest party will ever disagree about the position of the transaction in the sharded ledger. Persistence essentially expresses the agreement between honest parties on the transaction order. In other words, the finality of transactions if they're included deep enough in the ledger. And it is parameterized by a depth parameter K that represents the depth from which this property holds. And this parameter depends, of course, on the underlying consensus mechanism employed in each shard. For instance, if our consensus is PBFT, then this K equals to 1, because if the blocks include a transaction, transaction is included in a block, then this transaction is final. While in Bitcoin, this K is a parameter, and in practice, that might be 6, for instance. By the way, if anyone has any question at any point, please interrupt me, because this is a very long talk, and it's probably better if you understand the properties. So if any question arises, please stop me. So in contrast to single blockchains, in sharding, we require a second property, and we term this property consistency. Consistency states that there is no round in which 2 honest parties confirm 2 conflicting transactions. Essentially, consistency conveys the atomic property of cross-shard transactions. A reminder, cross-shard transactions are the transactions that span across multiple shards, and we need them to either abort or commit in all shards. Now, it might seem that consistency includes persistence, but that is not true. And we can simply think of examples where the one holds and the other fails. For instance, an example where persistency fails and consistency is satisfied if we revert the chain. In this case, you can understand that persistency fails because we change this depth parameter is violated from before, but we have no round in which the two honest parties have conflicting transactions. On the other hand, a case where persistency holds and consistency fails is when you double spend across different shards. Now, similarly to the traditional blockchains, we require the sharded ledger to make progress. And this is encapsulated by a property that is called liveness and states that if a transaction is broadcast, it will eventually be confirmed by all honest parties. And this property is parameterized by a wait time parameter called wait time. For this property, we further assume that we have large enough blocks. Now we have the fourth property that we define for sharded ledgers, and this is at the essence at the core of what a sharded system is. This property is a performance property and it's called scalability. Scalability essentially encapsulates the speedup of a sharded blockchain system compared to a non-sharded blockchain system. So we require sharding systems to scale in 3 dimensions, that is bandwidth, computation, and storage. The first dimension, bandwidth, is essentially the average number of messages per party, and is often expressed through the communication complexity of the subprotocols of the system. At this point, it is important to note that bandwidth, apart from the normal operation in epoch, is very important for the long run for sharding protocols. This will become probably clearer later, but in high level, the idea is that because the sharding protocols run for a long period of time, and we assume a slowly adaptive adversary, we need to shuffle the nodes and change the nodes among the shards. But when the node changes, he needs to bootstrap to the history of the new shard. And that can be a problem in sharding and affects the bandwidth at that point. The second dimension we require for a sharding system to scale is computation. Computation is the total number of times, we define it as the total number of times all parties perform transaction verifications. To capture the computational complexity, we assume the existence of a verification oracle, which can verify a transaction in constant time. Because what we care about is to measure the computational complexity by counting how many times all the parties will call this verification oracle. The third dimension, the final one, is the storage, and it is an important and often neglected component of sharding. With storage overhead, what we'll calculate is how much more data the sum of all the parties store in comparison to a single database where the data are only stored once. For instance, in Bitcoin, the storage is linear to the number of the parties because all the parties store the entire blockchain. In a sharding protocol, we require parties to store less than the entire blockchain, otherwise the system does not shard properly. So overall, we define a sharding protocol, one protocol that satisfies persistence, consistency, liveness, and scalability. Furthermore, we introduce a performance metric, which we term throughput factor, and expresses the average number of blocks that can be processed per round by a sharding protocol. Now, the throughput factor depends on 3 variables, essentially. The first one is how fast does the chain of each shard grows? And this is a metric that is already captured by the chain growth parameter in the Bitcoin backbone protocol paper. The second one, also known as chain quality, essentially measures how many honest blocks are created in comparison to the adversarial blocks in a limited amount, in a limited part of the chain. And the third one, and it's important here because it's different than normal chains, is the degree of parallelism. Now, the degree of parallelism, so these are the 3 things that matter to define the throughput factor. The degree of parallelism of a sharding protocol highly depends on the number of shards, as well as the average size of the transactions. What we essentially need to estimate is how many times that we run a consensus for each valid transaction until this transaction is included deep enough in the chain, so it's in the persistent part. Now, before moving on to the core of the paper to explore the boundaries of sharding, I will introduce some more assumptions in our model. The first assumption, the first thing that we assume is a constant block size, which is in sync with existing blockchains and sharding systems. This is important to understand why this is needed, because there are some quirks that override that, but that creates a problem in bandwidth. As you can simply understand, if we have a block size, for instance, that is linear to the number of shards or to the number of parties, then as the number of parties increase, so will the block size, which will in turn affect the bandwidth because this block or the latency, needs to be propagated in the network. So for this reason, to maintain low latency and the limits for bandwidth, we need this to be constant. This is in sync, as I said, with almost all the protocols out there, apart from one last quirk. The second assumption is that each transaction has a constant average size, meaning that the number of the inputs and outputs are on average a small constant number. And we are talking about a UTXO model. So this is how we defined everything. We consider this a reasonable assumption, given that in most cases, such as Bitcoin, the size of the transaction is approximately like 5. I want to note at that point that if you have a size of a transaction that is linear to the number of shards or the parties, then sharding is useless in practice. I think it's quite easy to prove that in this case, you can have no improvement over a blockchain, a normal blockchain. So our first result on the limitations of sharding is that there is no sharding protocol that can tolerate an adaptive adversary that can corrupt F parties, where F is greater than N over M, and N is the total number of parties, and M is the number of shards. To understand that, we can assume the opposite towards contradiction, and in this case, from the pigeonhole principle, we know that there is one shard of size N over M. And then the adversary can simply corrupt this shard, in which case, if the adversary corrupts the whole shard, he can double spend across shards. In this case, we break consistency. But someone could say, okay, what if we have the other nodes verify all the cross-shard transactions? Or probabilistically even check. But even if we probabilistically check, given the fact that the adversary can perform as many attacks as he wants if he has this shard, so produce as many transactions as he wants, only way to not have two shards that get the same, get a double spend essentially, is to verify everything, which means that every party needs to be at least a light client in all other shards, which in turn violates the scalability constraints that we discussed about, because the storage is linear to the number, it's linear. Yeah, essentially the storage only compresses by constant factor, because if you're a light node to every other chain, you maintain the whole information just compressed by a constant factor. But we want asymptotically to improve the storage. Now, for the next results, we will introduce another assumption. And this assumption is also in sync with the most proposed protocols. And this is that the UTXOs are partitioned uniformly at random into shards. Now, if we think about it, in a non-randomized process of creating shards, the adversary can, in theory, pre-compute and bias this process in a permissionless setting. Hence, all the sharding proposals employ some kind of random process to create the shards, to assign the UTXOs. On top of that, all the shards must have approximately the same amount of transactions, because otherwise the efficiency of our sharding protocol will depend on the shard that processes most transactions. And for this reason, we consider this assumption reasonable. Now, we assume that the UTXOs are random strings, which means that the constant fraction of transactions are cross-shard on expectation. And this leads us to our next result, where we show that there is no sharding protocol, but it requires the participants to be light nodes on the shards involved in cross-shard transactions. Essentially, this is a part of that I explained before, that if all the parties are light nodes, everything, what we simply do is we compress the blockchain by a constant factor, which is not enough for us. Now, to go to our final results, we introduce another assumption regarding the assignment of the parties into shards. Specifically, we assume that the parties are assigned to the shards uniformly at random. Now, if you think any other shard assignment strategy, in theory, yields equivalent or worse guarantees, since we have no knowledge on which parties are malicious. At this point, I would like to note that there is a protocol, the same one that has this block size that is not constant. It's called free to shard. And in this protocol, the parties' assignment to the shards is not done uniformly at random. It's actually free for the parties to choose where to go. But I strongly believe this protocol has a problem with finality, because the convergence of reaching a point where the shards are balanced, it's very slow. It takes many rounds, which means that until that point is reached, you cannot accept any transactions. So in my opinion, this doesn't work. But I would like to notice that to note that there are other solutions. People are trying to find other solutions. Okay, so what are the results under all these assumptions? The one is that any sharding protocol can scale up to n log n in our security model. And to prove that, what we do is we first upper bound the maximum number of shards that a sharding protocol can tolerate in a secure manner. We can simply imagine that we have n participants and we want to divide them in m shards. And these m shards, all of them should maintain the threshold for the consensus. We reach to a bound of n log n shards. This is the maximum number of shards we can have. And if we think that each shard stores at least t over n transactions, then the storage overhead we get is log n. Hence, this is the scalability bound. Now, our last result is that any sharding protocol must employ verifiable compaction of the state. And this result is quite important if we assume a non-static adversary. As we said before, we cannot have a fully adaptive adversary, but what we strive for is a slowly adaptive adversary. In such a case, we must, at the end of each epoch, where the adversary becomes adaptive, periodically reassign the parties to the shards. A simple, at this point though, the party that is assigned to a new shard must bootstrap to this new shard in order to be able to later verify the transactions. But if we don't have a way to do a verifiable compaction of state, then all the parties will have to download all the shard history, and the bound with the bench will eventually exceed that of a non-sharding blockchain protocol, because this grows infinitely. At this point, by verifiable compaction of state, I mean any protocol, a very simple one is use checkpointing, like create at the end of each epoch a block that you include a state block, essentially. What is the current state? For instance, include the UTXO pool, something like this. Okay, so now we move on to the second part of this work, where after we explore the boundaries of sharding, we were trying to design a roadmap for sharding. To do so, we first identified the essential components of a sharding protocol in order to decompartmentalize what sharding is, and then see what are the properties that we actually want from each of these protocols, and what is the logical order, the logical flow of the protocol to combine these in order to design something that is secure and efficient. Now, the first component is, of course, the shard consensus. So the consensus protocol that is run per shard. And this is, of course, necessary, but not sufficient to ensure persistence, liveness, and consistency in this sharding system. Now, what we require as properties for the consensus protocol is the typical blockchain properties from the backbone protocol, namely common prefix, chain quality, and chain growth. The second component, which is very important for sharding, is the cross-shard mechanism. And this is the protocol that handles the transactions that are span across multiple shards. Now, the cross-shard mechanism is critical for the security of the sharding system, as it, of course, guarantees the consistency, which is essentially the atomicity of transactions. Furthermore, the cross-shard mechanism is crucial for scalability, as if we naively design a cross-shard mechanism, we may induce a very high storage and communication overhead to the nodes that handle multiple cross-shard transactions. So what we require essentially is the efficiency property and the atomicity of the transactions from this protocol. Now, the third component is a Sybil-resistant mechanism. And this is necessary for essentially reaching global consensus on the new set of identities for each epoch in a permissionless system. Now, this is required to guarantee the security bounds, of course, of the consensus protocol. Now, given a slowly adaptive adversary, the Sybil resistant mechanism typically needs to depend on the unknown randomness of the previous epoch. Now, the exact protocol that is employed is irrelevant for us, so you can use proof of work, proof of stake, proof of space, whatever. But the guarantees that we want are specific, and there are four. The first one is that we need all the parties to agree on the same set of identities. The second one is that we require that no malicious party can ever convince any honest party that its identity is valid for an epoch while it's not. The third one concerns privacy, and we want that the protocol does not leak any private information, for instance, the private key of a party. And the fourth one is that for each party, we want the probability of being granted an identity to be proportional to the resources that the party invested. For instance, if we invest 20% of the computational power, we want to have 20%, or approximately, let's say 20% probability of winning an identity on each epoch. Now we go to the fourth component, which is very important, and it's the protocol that divides people into shards, the participants into the shards. Now, to satisfy the transaction finality, we want either the consensus security bounds to hold for each shard, or we must design a protocol that guarantees with high probability that if someone at some point, the adversary compromises a shard, then the security violation will be restored in a specific and small number of rounds. Otherwise, we can't have finality. So there are two different directions we can go, and we choose to divide participants into shards. So in our protocol abstraction, in a way that we maintain the security bounds. The reason for this choice is that every other protocol that has tried to do some other technique, so allowing the violation and then restoring it, typically falls into some specific problems. So you either need some strong assumptions, or you typically lose data availability. So what are the properties that we want for this component? So the divide to shards protocol. The first one is we need every party to know its shard assignment. The second one is that we want the protocol to terminate efficiently with respect to the epoch size, essentially, how many rounds has an epoch. The third is that if we're given a bounded adversary, we want the distribution of the parties into the shards to maintain this power of the adversary. What I want to say by this is, if the adversary has, for instance, 25% of the computational power of the system, after we shuffle the nodes, so we employ this component, we want to know a threshold for the adversary in each of the shards. Let's say this is 33%, but we need to have these security guarantees. And now we move on to the fifth component of sharding, and that is the distributed randomness generation protocol. Now, this is necessary for every setting and should provide an unbiasable randomness such that both the Sybil resistant mechanism and the divide to shards maintains the security bounds of the consensus. And then the sixth component, which, as I said before, is quite important. This is a compact state, and it's important for the scalability. Because, as I said before, when the nodes change shards, must bootstrap to the new chain. Another part that we require from the compact state protocol is to broadcast to all nodes in the network the information. In our protocol abstraction, we choose to do that via a reliable broadcast protocol, but any protocol that can guarantee data integrity and data availability is enough. So for this protocol, what we require are the following properties. The first one is that the state should be significantly compressed. And by significantly, we mean asymptotically more than constant. The second one is that the compression should be verifiable. And the third one is the data can be retrieved and the data are available. So to maintain scalability, we also must make sure that this protocol has an efficient communication complexity, at least with respect to the epoch size. This can be a heavy protocol, like I said, reliable broadcast, but since it happens only once, this complexity can be amortized through the rounds of the epoch. I would also like to note at this point that this is an important step, the broadcast step, because otherwise, even though all the components could maintain liveness, the liveness of the system can be broken due to data unavailability. You will see such an attack at the end of the talk. And now we move on to the last component, which is simply how to partition the state. This is an important component for consistency and scalability, because of course you need to make sure that no two shards verify to conflicting transactions. And you should do that in an efficient manner, because if you send all the transactions of an epoch in one shard, you essentially lose the throughput and the scalability, as it acts like a single blockchain, essentially. Now, I will just show you the flow of the protocol abstraction that we designed by using these specific components with these properties that we discussed. Now, at the beginning of each epoch, we employ the Sybil resistance mechanism, which create new identities for the epoch. Then we employ the distributed randomness generation protocol to create the new epoch randomness, which is used for the subprotocols later and for the divide to shards. So the next step is to employ the divide to shards to essentially shuffle the nodes to defend against slowly adaptive adversaries. Now, within an epoch, we of course partition the state, meaning that we partition the transaction into the shards in a secure and efficient manner. And then we, depending on the nature of a transaction, meaning if it is inter-shard or cross-shard, we employ either the shard consensus or the cross-shard mechanism. Now, the cross-shard mechanism is typically an atomic commit protocol, but it can be done in other ways. What we want, as we said, is to make sure that atomicity of transactions is maintained. Now, the cross-shard mechanism typically employs a shard consensus, which, as we said, we want to have persistence and liveness. At the end of each epoch, we employ the compact state protocol that securely compresses the epoch's data and then broadcasts this data to the network. Now, for scalability and throughput, all of the components are important, but we focus mainly, of course, I mean, the designer's decisions are very important in how scalable the protocol is and how high the throughput is. But the main thing that we focus is on the epoch change for scalability, because as we said before, the protocols of distributed randomness, the Sybil resistance, the compact state, and the division to shards could be very heavy communication-wise. And at this point, it's important to have a long epochs, so we can't have a quickly adaptive adversary. We have to have a slowly adaptive adversary, because these heavy protocols should be amortized, their communication complexity should be amortized through the epoch. And for throughput, we mainly look at the actual operation of the epoch, which is the partition of the state, the shard consensus, and the cross-shard mechanism. The partition of the state, of course, is important because, as we said, if we send everything in one shard, then the throughput would be limited by the blockchain, the normal blockchain throughput, or the BFT, whatever the shard runs. And on the other hand, we have the shard consensus, which determines essentially, as we said before, the chain quality and the chain growth, which are the parameters for throughput, and the cross-shard mechanism that determines the degree of parallelism. So how many shards are affected and should work for a specific transaction. And that concludes the second part of the talk. Any questions so far? Okay. So in the third part of this work, what we did is to evaluate existing protocols under our model. Specifically, we chose some of the most prominent and most cited protocols, and we identified their security vulnerabilities. We showed that Elastico does not satisfy consistency and scalability. Monoxide does not satisfy scalability. OmniLedger fails in liveness. And we have RapidChain and chain space that satisfy our properties. But RapidChain satisfies our properties under a weaker threat model, where the adversary, where at the epoch change, the parties that can add, join, or leave the network is constant, and the adversary can only change a constant number of corruptions. While in chain space, we were more interested in that because of the new cross-shard mechanism they introduced. But the setting is permissioned and it has a static adversary. But nevertheless, they satisfy the protocol, the properties that we introduced. So I will go through the first three to explain to you the vulnerabilities. But to do so, I will try first to give you a brief high-level description of what the protocol, each protocol does to understand the attacks. Now, Elastico is the first distributed blockchain sharding protocol, and it lies in the intersection of the Nakamoto consensus and the BFT protocols. The setting is permissionless, and each participant creates a valid identity using proof of work. The adversary controls 25% of the computational power, and the setting is static. The adversary is slowly adaptive, everything as in our model, and the protocol is synchronous. It also proceeds in epochs, but the epochs here are kind of different. You will understand later that epochs here is kind of the creation of a block. Now, at the beginning of each epoch, the participants are partitioned into small shards, which are called committees. Each shard then contacts something they call the director committee to identify the other members of the shard. This is not important for us at the moment, but they show that this can be done in a secure manner. Now, what are the parts that are important for us is how they divide the transactions into the shards and the members into the shards. Okay, so the transactions are randomly partitioned in these joint sets based on the hash of the transaction input. So in the UTXO model, we hash the multiple inputs, and whatever this outcome is, it is correlated with a specific shard. Now, of course, this is fine scalability-wise because each shard only processes a fraction of the total transactions in the system. But as we will show later, this has a problem for consistency. Now, the other part that is important for scalability is that the shard members, the way that the BFT protocols operate is that the shard members run a BFT to validate the shard's transactions. And then what they do is they send these blocks to the final committee. This is one committee of size logn. Now, this final committee is in charge of essentially two operations. The first one is to compute and broadcast this final block, as they call it, which is a digital signature on the union of all the valid received transactions. But they execute there a BFT protocol, but note here that they execute this BFT protocol not on the validity of transactions, but they check the signatures of like they know who are the shards that are assigned to this thing, to this shard, and they check if the signatures are the majority, for instance. So they don't check the transactions. And the second job is to generate and broadcast this bounded exponential biased random string that is used later for, as we described in the proof of work, for the next epoch generally. So let's see where the problem is. The first problem is that since we have everyone sending their block to the final committee, and the final committee and this final block contains the Merkle hash root of every block of all the shards, and this is then broadcast to the network, and all the parties maintain it. Essentially, we have everyone maintaining a hash chain, which fails the storage dimension as we defined it in our model. But most importantly, where it fails is consistency. This thing can be fixed though, but at the moment, as the paper is written, the transactions are assigned to the shards by hashing their input. For instance, look at the transaction 1 and transaction 2 I have here. The first UTXO is the same in both, but the second one, the second input is different. This means that with significant probability, these hashes will, these transactions will be assigned to different shards. For both these shards at this point in time, these UTXOs are valid, are unspent, which means that both the committees will validate this transaction. And since the final committee does not check actually the validity of the transactions, both these transactions will be included, which of course violates the security properties because it breaks, you can double spend essentially. Now, in theory, as we said before, because we can compartmentalize the way these protocols work, we can replace this part with another technique like what they use in OmniLedger, what they use in RapidChain, for instance. Now let's move to the second protocol that we studied in detail. Now, this protocol is called Monoxide, and it claims to be an asynchronous proof of work protocol where the adversary can control at most 50% of the computational power and actually do sharding. Now, in this protocol, the parties are permanently assigned to shards, and each shard runs the ghost protocol. This is a consensus protocol that is DAG-based, not important for us, some consensus protocol. Now, since Monoxide is proof of work, of course, in theory, it should suffer from a trivial attack of having the adversary target simply all his computational power in one shard, because you can have many identities and you just change where you focus your power. Now, to address this problem, Monoxide introduces a new mining algorithm, which is called CHU-CONU, and enables the miners to mine in parallel for all the shards. Now, the successful miners include transactions in the blocks from all the shards. But this mining algorithm has a major caveat, and that is that every miner must essentially perform transaction validation in all the shards. Therefore, the miner maintains the shard history for every shard, and they actually write that a miner will perform the transaction validation for all block end zones. These are the shards. So obviously, in our model, scalability fails. Now let's move to the third protocol we evaluated, and that is called OmniLedger. Now, OmniLedger proceeds in epochs, as in our model, assumes a partially synchronous model. We make it synchronous here. It has a slowly adaptive computational bound adversary and can corrupt again 25%. The total power of the adversary is 25% of the computational power. In high level, the protocol bootstraps using some techniques from a consensus protocol called Bitcoin. Well, the high-level idea, the core idea is that you have a global identity blockchain that is extended once per epoch using the simply resistant proofs, like proof of work here, which are coupled with public keys. Now, at the beginning of each epoch, you have a sliding window, which is employed to determine which are the so-called validators for the epoch. The UTXO space is partitioned uniformly at random into the M shards, and each shard, of course, maintains its own ledger running the Bitcoin protocol. Now, at the beginning of each epoch in OmniLedger, we have a new common random value that is created using a distributed randomness generation protocol. Specifically, what they employ is a protocol that, if I remember correctly, employs VRFs, verifiable random functions, to elect a leader. And this leader runs roundhound to produce this random value, and they show in this paper they have shown that this roundhound is securing a synchrony, let's say, partial synchrony. Now, this random value is used to create the next epoch's identity. So it kind of works like our protocol abstraction, if you think about it. For the cross-shard mechanism, OmniLedger introduces atomics, which is a client-driven atomic commit protocol that is secure against Byzantine adversaries. And this means that the client sends to multiple shards, and either he collects all the signatures from all shards that all the inputs are valid, or he collects a rejection, and then everybody aborts. Now, we need to understand the flow of OmniLedger to understand where the attack is. Now, check. Okay, as I said here, I forgot to say, I'm sorry, that OmniLedger at the end of each epoch uses checkpoints. So what they do is they have this state block where they summarize the state. Now, in a UTXO setting as ours, this means that we include the UTXO pool. Great. But then in epoch I+1, the next epoch, we need, it reshuffles the nodes, and these nodes need to bootstrap and download at least this state block. But it doesn't broadcast. So what happens is, for OmniLedger, that the adversary, since we assume that the adversary is adaptive during the epoch transition, the adversary can corrupt the whole shard, which means that when the new nodes go to bootstrap, then they have no data available because the state block is not given by them. Simply the adversary can corrupt the whole shard and fail. Of course, this is very easy to fix because, as we said, we can simply employ a reliable broadcast protocol that is happening at this point, like before, at the moment that we create the state block, we broadcast it, and then we employ the divide the shards protocol. So I think this concludes my talk, and I will do a very quick recap. So what we did in this work was to introduce a framework where we formalize what a distributed sharded ledger is, and we define the necessary properties to achieve robust sharding. These properties are persistence, consistency, liveness, and scalability. We further defined a performance metric, which we termed throughput factor, to estimate the transaction throughput improvement of sharding blockchains in comparison to non-sharding blockchains. Then we explored the limitation and boundaries of secure and efficient sharding, and we identified the critical and sufficient ingredients for designing robust sharded ledgers, and presented a protocol abstraction, which we termed the sharding crux, for to demonstrate how to use these ingredients to create a robust sharded ledger. At this work, we also evaluated the existing protocols in our model, and we showed that OmniLedger, Monoxide, and Elastico fail to satisfy some of the properties, while RapidChain satisfies some of the necessary properties in a weaker adversarial model, and the same holds for chain space also in a very limited model. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Zeta. That was very interesting. Let me start with a question that has been pointed out before in the seminar, I think a couple months back, and that pertains to using a hash of the UTXO to, or of the transaction, of the UTXO of a transaction to place a transaction into a shard, or using an alternative mechanism such as sharding by address. And my worry in this is always, can the adversary maybe overwhelm a shard by maybe employing a sort of denial of service attack and placing a lot of transactions in that particular shard? And I guess my question here is this attack possible in practice, and is this captured by your model, or is this something that is only a practical attack but not captured by the theory?
It is not captured by the model. If you actually read the paper, this partitioning part, this component, in our model is taken, we assume essentially that this is not a problem. So yes, I believe it is a practical problem, but aren't there ways to mitigate it? Like, I remember Mir talked a little bit about that. So as you understand, my work is completely theoretical. So I assume that this part is solved. But yeah, I think people are actually working to mitigate it with some, like, I think they just say that you cannot have more than, I don't know, 1,000 transactions going there, like from this address. But yeah, it's not captured here.
I guess a fee schedule may be also usable there, who knows? But yeah, you're right. It was mentioned in the Mir talk. Okay, thank you. Any further questions by the audience for Zeta? Okay, if there are no further questions, maybe we can wrap this up early. So thank you very much, Zeta, for taking the time today to speak to us. And yeah, this is the last seminar of the academic year. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending today and for attending throughout the year. It was really wonderful to have you as audience and as speakers. Hopefully we can resume next year. We'll see. We'll send out an announcement. But yeah, without further ado, have a nice summer and some nice vacations, and see you all next year. Bye.
Thank you, Diotis. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.